Good afternoon and welcome to our webcast. Is big data a bigger deal than cloud computing? I'm joined here today by Nathan Banks of IBM, John Brand of Forrester, Rami Mukhtar from NICTA, and Mark Cording from Telstra. John?
I'd certainly see that, and Forrester has the view, there's two key things that have changed with big data. One is that it's broken that traditional link between the volume of data to be managed and the cost of the infrastructure required to manage it. So there's a clear disconnect now between that cost equation. Before, the more data you threw at something, the more infrastructure you had to throw at it, and the costs went up, not even linearly. It was an exponential cost increase to manage that huge volume of data. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that data is no longer needing to be owned and stored and managed internally anymore, that you're using data from a variety of sources. And so there's a number of other attributes that we often talk about, the variety and the velocity of data and all of those things. I think those two key things in themselves are really what defines big data.
Well, for me, I guess I have quite a different perspective. As a data scientist, big data is a paradigm for me. It's really the paradigm of being able to really have this digital shoebox where we can just ingest data very cheaply, very quickly in an agile way without having to put a lot of effort into how do we structure this to meet our data models and our information management systems. And as a data scientist, that enables me then to cherry pick what I want from the data as opposed to waiting for 18 months of an IT flow to get something into a normalized model, which is going to aggregate everything up. And by that time, all of the really interesting transactional information has been thrown away. So I can go and cherry pick, go to a very granular detail in each of the data assets and correlate that across data assets using new algorithms to really determine what sort of patterns of behavior I'm seeing in the way customers interact with a business or in the way a business operates. So that's what I see big data as.
Yeah, to me, big data is a fairly vague umbrella term, and there's a lot of stuff huddled under that umbrella. You get social networking talked about under that umbrella, analytics, database, management systems, text analytics, everyone's trying to huddle under that umbrella because it's got the spotlight on it at the moment. But I think Telstra, our attitude is a fairly practical one, like how can we get business value out of these new technologies and how new are these technologies really? I'd sort of say there's been a natural evolution in certain technologies and now we've got much more processing power available to us. We can do types of processing we wouldn't have thought of before. So our focus pretty much with big data at the moment is around analytics, and it is about taking our data warehousing and our reporting and analytics infrastructure to the next level, but not just for the sake of it, it's in order to provide business value. So we're kind of extending our architectures to accommodate some of the big data componentry and capabilities. We're still kind of waiting for the business problems and the business of thinking to catch up with that. We know that the areas where we can make a lot of money out of big data or reduce costs and all those kinds of things, but the business is still sort of thinking those things through. So it's a bit experimental at the moment, still in the thinking stage to a large extent, barring a few kind of experiments going on around the place.
But that really touched on one of the fundamentals, that it's got to be around the business objectives, the strategies that your organisation is actually trying to achieve. Big data, cloud computing, all of these have to help to achieve those goals. Yeah. Yes, there's a lot of analytics going on, as I say, in some of the traditional analytic type companies, the telcos, the banks again, but then that's also extending into whole other areas. So you look at the natural resource sector where suddenly you can start using the wealth of data you got from sensors on the and SCADA data from the machinery to actually look at predictive maintenance, looking at ways of keeping your operations running for longer periods. And again, all of that is using the same kind of breadth of tools and capabilities that you're seeing used in the more traditional analytics organisations.
Yeah, I fully agree. It's got to start with the business problem. And I think it's got to go one step further. You've got to identify how a solution is going to actually add value to the business and address that problem. But is it practical to actually apply those insights, in a time frame of relevance, with a cost of relevance? I mean, you may generate incredible insights that may directly address a business problem, but the cost of actually rolling out and acting upon those insights may exceed the actual benefit to the business. So you really have to weigh that up.
In many cases, real time is coming to the fore in terms of and big data, and that the ability to stream information and make instant decisions from it is becoming more fundamental with the more data that's becoming available. It's maybe a bit of an odd concept, but that wealth of information is meaning, yeah, you need to be able to apply it quickly, and if you can't, do you get the same value out of it?
That's right.
Well,
and therefore, there's a whole big cost equation.
Exactly.
That is a good point. I mean, obviously, real time is a key component of the overall equation here, because the general talk when it comes to the tech scene or ICT industry is all about agility. But just following from what Nathan, you were saying earlier, the idea that you have to have a clear business objective. I mean, I guess the first reaction for most businesses would be to sort of follow on from the data warehousing story that they've already experienced, and which is to really collect everything under the sun. And that in itself,
I think that's a bit of a myth. I don't think the data warehouse collects everything under the sun. The data warehouse is by definition an aggregate store. It's a summary store of what's happening. I mean,
in fact, in many cases, it stopped more data coming in.
That's
it was
right.
actively pushing data out.
Exactly.
Yeah, that depends how you architect your data warehouse though.
Sure.
Like in the larger companies, data warehouses do have transactional data, but the point is you're trying to pre-process all that data before it gets into the data warehouse. So you've already made a lot of assumptions about how that data is going to be used. You've structured it in some kind of third normal form.
That's right.
You know that the reporting people want multi-dimensional kind of views, and you've made it sort of not so hot for the analysts. So I think we've had one of the strange side effects of big data is it's caused a shift in what is regarded as the ideal architecture for reporting analytics. Like we've had the same model in our minds for the last 20 years or so. A lot of data going into one data warehouse, one BI tool, everyone happy. It hasn't worked.
That's
you know,
right.
so big companies have ended up with lots of data warehouses, not one data warehouse, lots of costs. And you know, we've got reporting kind of nailed, but analysts haven't really gotten what they need. So I think we haven't got the real time, we haven't got the analytical platform set up properly, and those are the sorts of things big data enables. You know, really the database management systems, the Hadoops, all those things. Suddenly, it's at a reasonable price, you can buy massive amounts of processing power. You know, parallel databases used to be the province of Teradata. Now there's new entrants, all the main players are coming with their own parallel databases. You put so much data in memory, it's not funny. You've got all this capability sitting there. So a lot of people are revisiting what they've kind of discarded as not possible before. And algorithms they couldn't run before, they can run now. So, you know, we'll start looking at it, it'll be real time, it'll be more types of data, etc., etc.
But you're right, the challenge is taking real-time output and turning it into real-time decision-making, and most organisations aren't there. And if we look at the customers who are early adopters of the technology, there's a clear trend that they're focusing on big data as in big data repositories, not deep analytics and the ability to integrate that real-time capability. So we're seeing that there's this, you know, long period of education and trial and error, and we expect to see a lot more error as time goes on because of that issue of we don't know what the business case is, we believe there's something to it, but we don't know exactly how we can apply it, and even if we work that out, is the organisation ready to be able to enable this kind of real-time automated decision making in the organisation? Is that really the way our organisation is structured politically? You know, but people feel that they need to be in control of business processes often.
I would imagine there'd be a substantial amount of reluctance to making business decisions unless you have that, well, not 100%, but quite a solid amount of certainty.
I think there's a spectrum. I mean, obviously, the sort of decisions you make, which are based on finance and risk, are very different from the decisions you make in marketing and sales. So the sort of reporting and decision making you need for finance and risk is very different and has very different accuracy and reconcilable traceability requirements to what you're going to do with next best offer, for example, in marketing or sales. So I think there is a spectrum. In fact, I think that's where there's been a fundamental failure in the data warehouse, in that it's a one data warehouse fits all. We're using the same data warehouse for finance and reporting with the same rigorousness around you know, what we store in our warehouse that we do for marketing and sales, where we want to be absolutely agile and we want to run models and we don't care if we're 30% accurate. We just want to get, you know, the best possible ROMI.
Yeah, in a number of cases over the years, I've seen the need where you've got the structured warehouse that's built for reporting, actually then for advanced analytics, you're looking for that granular level.
Exactly.
You end up with another version of the database.
That's right.
It normally comes from the same source, but
exactly.
you've got that second piece, and now the ability to actually analyse on the fly, take that information through, understand the value up front, using the capabilities that within the big data environment these days, enables you to actually make decisions on what you need to actually store.
Yes. The decisions are made on two different bases. One is as an indicator and one is evidence.
Yep.
And data warehousing usually was decision making based on evidence. It had to be good, high quality data in order to get a decision through. And people would test that data throughout the organisation, even though they had one single version of the truth. that still didn't make decision making easy.
Yeah.
It simply meant that they argued a lot more about the definitions of that data. And I think that the challenge is, big data inherently is more of an indicator, not evidence. And so that cultural shift that has to change in the organisation to say, look, it might not be 100% accurate, but as an indicator, maybe this is something we need to take seriously. That's a challenge.
And that's I think why you're seeing is that kind of next best action type of environment that the take up is initially happening, and that does make sense in that it's something. I come from a marketing background. It's something we've been looking at for 20 plus years,
That's
and
right.
the ability is now there to do it and do it on the most granular level of information available. So call data records,
Yes.
interactions with the website, actually as someone moves through the website, identifying what ad you're going to put up to them when they log on to your internet banking site. All those things are now available, and that's an easier step for organisations to make. Yes, it's going to be a far bigger piece where you look at that, the organisational data, the finance and reporting pieces where, people are used to it, it's got to be right.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's going to be
Absolutely.
legal issues around it, the accuracy levels, etc., that have to be handled as you move forward.
Precisely.
Well, so if some of the services and products you're going to offer are going to be location aware, it's got to be real time. They need to know where you're walking, sort of thing, if they're going to offer products and services based on location. So, you can't do certain things without the real time. But your question, there's kind of a life cycle for ideas, and I think before you get to a big business case, with all the effort that goes into a business case, and it is a big exercise producing a solid business case for a lot of expenditure, I think there's experimentation that happens in the business. And that's healthy, and so someone will download Hadoop and fiddle around with it and put some data in and learn how to work that, or we'll get a massively parallel database and put, say, mobile data records in there and do some analysis there, and so you sort of learn as you go, and then you start to put sort of the bigger case together about we want a prolonged investment in a platform to support general kind of reporting and analytics. And some people might not be clear on reporting versus analytics, and to me, reporting is about how do I display data in a useful way, but analytics is about model building. It's a very different activity. It's about building something that takes inputs and produces outputs. It's like science and mathematics and statistics, and it's you don't find people walking down the street with all the skills needed for that. So you need to form teams, with your statisticians and your mathematicians and your business people and your IT people. Kind of that team is your data scientist. It's not so straightforward.
No, I mean we at IBM have started to use the terms of descriptive analytics for that what traditionally was called reporting.
Yeah.
The ability to look at data, still to slice and dice, rearview mirror type information, understand what's happened in the past. And then you've got the predictive and the prescriptive analytics, which is where you're looking to predict future behaviours or future activities, or actually optimise around all the different options that you have as a business.
Yep.
And that change, or that broad range of analytical requirements does, again, stretches data warehousing without a shadow of a doubt. So potentially the capabilities that we're bringing on and talking about now will enable you to start by testing, actually do analyse, look at what you're trying to do as a business, look at the data that's available, use analytics, whether it's descriptive or predictive, to understand what value that data has for you, and then that starts to build into the business case as to why you should invest and move forward.
And from the business, they're going to be confused and confounded by a lot of the opportunities that are pushed forward to them. There's a lot of vendors, not naming anyone in particular, but there's a lot of vendors out there who go with some good big ideas to organisations that sounds really sexy, but trying to translate that into something that is meaningful, useful, and cost effective for the organisation, I think is still going to be a challenge for a while yet.
Now, gentlemen, keeping the complexity of this trend in mind, surely there have been some notable examples where sort of big data number crunching has actually led to some really positive results.
Yeah,
Sure.
look,
Internet properties.
yeah. Well, you'd have lots of examples, but I would say that Telstra's always been a big data company. We've, and the banks always pushed the limits of technology, always processed massive amounts of data, and we're doing smart things with our data. Have been for a long time. The marketing side, asset management side, network management, fault management, network planning. All that. We've done a lot of very smart stuff. But I think some of the algorithms that we used to run, which would take a month, we can now run in maybe a few minutes. And that just opens up a whole lot of new possibilities. Proactive assurance. Before your phone doesn't work for you, we've already fixed it because we knew it was broken. All that kind of stuff. the marketing side, very sophisticated marketing, but now you know, we've got all this mobile data coming in. Well, we can make use of that. Location data coming in, we can make use of that. Machine-to-machine type data, you know, devices talking to devices, we can make use of that. That's going to flood everything. Like we get 2 billion mobile data records a day, 2 billion of them. So it's a lot of data. We know what to do with it. It's a matter of setting it up so we can do with it, and that costs money. So.
You're starting to see, I've seen examples in Asia of case studies where banks are, telcos are actually leveraging that information. They are starting to send out targeted offers. I still don't think as real time as they could be. No. There's still a little bit of a batch piece going on there, but definitely taking that step forward. And then you look in the US, you're starting to see the credit card companies are looking at how they can use location data and doing that integration between your phone and your credit card, and how can you actually send targeted, focused, again, offers. Again, marketing is one of the key areas that are using this initially. But that ability to actually use the combination of all the data available to actually point the right message at the right time.
And I think that's the challenge is, you know, if you look at the applications, particularly in marketing, it's always been around analysing the transactional data to try and identify patterns in behaviours. But the interesting thing is, you know, now we've got a new set of data, the location data and the context data that we're getting from a lot of the social environments. Bringing all of that data together gives us a whole different way of approaching decision making. So, you know, we're now seeing organisations doing a lot of, you know, deep analytics in integrating transactional and social data, and then realising that actually our spend in social media is not that potent because we get 100,000 a day people passing our billboard with one message that we want to put out to the market, as opposed to trying to tailor a specific message to every individual customer, which is actually 98% wasted effort, and we know that from the analytics that we're doing. So I think that, you know, there's going to be that challenge of where to apply it in a way that makes sense. But half the challenge is we've got a new type of data set to work with, this location data that we've just never had before. We don't know how best to manage it.
Oh, and I think it's not just location. I mean, I think it's location. I think it's interaction. It's getting to that level where those cool data records are being used far more broadly than they have been historically. That you're using all of those sources from social media, from use of the web, etc. All of that aren't necessarily brand new, but their use, I think, is pretty new.
Well, that's it. How to apply that data,
bringing them into the piece and into the understanding of your consumer. And I think it's become more fundamental as the focus for consumers is more around the relationship they have with their providers, and the understanding that more and more consumers have that they are providing information and data and they want something in return. They're happy, whereas 20 years ago it was all Big Brother and you don't want to know or don't want people to understand your data. Consumers, I think, more and more now understand they are providing data, but they want something back in return, and that's that insight, that understanding is how you're going to deliver the customer experience that actually for many sectors, industry sectors, is going to be the differentiation that you provide rather than necessarily within products.
I think customers expect relevancy.
Yeah.
That's really...
But, you know, is this really just, you know, I mean, this makes a lot of sense. I mean, for an average listener here, you know, you would think that this is really something that only big enterprises can afford, you know. But what about the SMB space? I mean, if you're a small business owner, how can you use this technology?
I think the biggest challenge is data assets for the SMB space. So if we look at a company like a telco, you know, they've got very rich data assets, CDRs, MDRs, very rich data assets, which they can derive a lot of value, a lot of data products from. But if that company then said, well, hey, why don't we now monetize these data products, these derived data products, and sell them off to enable activities within the SMB space, I think the customers would then have a problem. Knowing that, you know, data products could potentially be derived from their activities with a telco or their interactions with a telco. So I think they're the sort of challenges that, you know, are really going to somewhat hinder, you know, the use of some of these richer data assets being really sort of packaged up and, you know, through analytics packaged up and then benefiting sort of the wider audience. I mean, that's my perspective.
You often get the impression that, you know, big data only applies to telcos and banks, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because they're
and
the
retailers.
And maybe, you know, retailers from that
retailers, resource companies. I think
right.
it's a growing range. I mean, we've seen in research over the last couple of years that more and more analytics is being seen as a fundamental. Whereas traditionally it was the banking, telco sectors, etc., where the focal point was, it's now actually a fundamental for all businesses, and the organisations are starting to see that they actually need to use analytics to get a competitive advantage. So I do see it spreading. I think it's also philosophically, big data for a small organisation is not necessarily the same as big data for a large organisation. It is just the maximisation of the information you have available to you. So I don't think it's going to be for everyone, but for sectors where they have some level of data, the kind of tools and capabilities that they have will enable, or the tools and capabilities available in the marketplace is going to enable them to actually take advantage of analytics, and that's where the cloud piece and the private and public cloud and the services that can be provided enable them to take advantage of those tools, where historically it would have been a big investment in capability as well as in And
we see some left field ones. There's a rare tropical fish supplier out of Asia that is doing some really interesting things by integrating weather records with telemetry from their delivery vehicles, with traffic information to work out, what is the most optimal time and route to take to get these fish alive to their customers. And I mean, it's not a massive data application in terms of the scale of volume of data, but it is integrating all of these data sets, and it's doing something extremely.
For me, that's big data.
It's
big data. It's not the volume, but it is the principle.
Yeah, distinct data sources.
It's kind of back to basics. I think one of the things big data has caused is people rethought analytics. It was kind of a quiet topic, not talked about much. Now suddenly everyone's thinking about it again, and your fish supplier is, maybe inspired by all this big data talk, has had a rethink about how to be smart in this business. And there's a couple of books that come out recently on business analytics, written by business people for business people, not technical books. And also the McKinsey report that started the whole big data jargons, and that was aimed at CEOs, not IT people. So I think big data is actually a business trend as well as an IT trend. And people are just rethinking their whole usage of their information assets.
Well, that's sort of true of most of these trends in recent times, isn't it? Whether it's the mobility BYOD trend or cloud, what you really need is this sort of, bring IT into the boardroom, where it's not just the CEO making, the whole paradigm of decision making now needs to be a much more cohesive process.
We've seen, if you look at data mining, the term data mining, which thankfully hasn't been used a lot over the past few years at least, but IT can be extremely honest sometimes, so it's far too honest for its own good. So data mining was literally a mining process. You would sift through huge amounts of data for that one little tiny fleck of gold. And the big data realm is really about creating like data alchemists. It's creating something from nothing. It's not sifting through a whole bunch of stuff to find that one element. So this issue of having good skills as data scientists, I think that is really where the business and IT need to start coming together right away. It's not forget the infrastructure and the technology. Yes, you can kind of build that out and test and trial it. But what you really need to do is identify who's got the skills to be able to help the business understand where the opportunity is. Stop talking about big data and start talking about big impact.
And I think we shouldn't really underestimate just the level of skill that's required. The analyst to actually take that data and transform it into business insight, that's a non-trivial task.
Well, that's the thing, right? Finding these alchemists is not that easy right now.
It requires somebody who's quite, mathematically aware, but also quite creative and has quite a good understanding about the business operations.
They've got to understand the business process. They've got to understand all the data elements.
That's right.
They've got to understand a lot of the political environments inside organisations.
Exactly.
You don't find one person.
So, Ryan, what is the state, of that data scientist market right now? And how can you address the current state of the market, given that there is a dearth of data scientists?
Yeah, I do think that there's a big gap, really, and in the capability that we have here available to really go into enterprise and contribute value. If you look at the skills of a data scientist, you've got this sort of machine learning, which is a really important part, which really arms you with the algorithms to turn that data into business insight. Then you've got the computer science understanding, which enables you to code those algorithms up in a scalable way so that they can actually produce insight over large data sets. And then you've got a very important point of the data and business understanding. And so somebody who can really be somewhat across all three of those things is quite rare, and it's something which really is only beginning to have an awareness within the market. So we're seeing a lot of people from electrical engineering, from computational physics and chemistry, who have got a very entrepreneurial streak in them, actually taking their career in that direction. And I think that's really where the opportunity is right at this moment. To extract value, it's not about technology, it's about the people who are going to be able to work, embed themselves within the business, live within the business, understand the data assets, but have that strong computer science and algorithmic expertise to turn those data assets into insight. insights.
And that's also a challenge, because you get the people who are very good at their job, and we've seen it in financial services for decades. If you understand that data, you put it in a spreadsheet and you make sure that nobody else gets hold of it, right? You don't put it in the data warehouse where everybody can make use of it. So I think that all of those issues still come into play, and it's trying to get through all of the cultural barriers and biases in organisations, which will take some considerable time. But to the point before, you've got to start somewhere. You've got to be able to get some trials in place, do some experimentation, build the level of education, because there aren't those skills out there. So it is this period of discovery almost around what the technology is capable of doing and how best to apply it in the organisation. It's people sort of coming in and saying, I've got the answer to your problems, really isn't the way forward that we're seeing anyway.
No, and it's all, but the one thing I would say is it can also be about teams of people. I mean,
I do refer that as a team.
Historically, I mean, coming from a marketing agency background, we did a lot of data analytics, traditional predictive modelling, that kind of thing. And you get that combination that you get the best. It has to be said, the best advanced analytics practitioners undoubtedly do have an understanding of the business. They're not just complete scientists by any stretch of imagination. Yes. But you combine those with business people with an understanding of data, and then you start to actually get a melded group that can actually really understand the potential.
But I think that's really important. If it is going to be a team, it's going to be a team that have to be able to work together. And, and that's not easy to construct in a vacuum.
Because I mean, this shortage of skills, you'd have to imagine, is a constraint when it comes to businesses trying to explore.
I really do think it is a constraint today. I think it's a big constraint. There are plenty of analysts out there, but analysts have a way of doing things that have sort of evolved over the last 20 or 30 years in analytics and enterprise. And I think this is quite a departure in that we're now working with data sets which are not very rich. So you have to be able to take a data set which hasn't been well structured, which hasn't been normalized, which hasn't been cleansed, and you have to really apply algorithms to extract value out of those data sets, which you can then, before you can even get to the modeling stage. So I think it's sort of a new or evolution set of skills from what a typical analyst would have worked with, say, off a data warehouse.
I think your typical analyst is really about a report writer. They've learned how to do multi-dimensional cubes. They probably started with Cognos or business objects or something like that. And they really are report generators, or they create an environment within which people can create reports. So the sort of skills you're talking about, mathematics is at the core, understanding some mathematics, so it might be a quant, like an economic quant, someone like that, but someone who really understands the mathematics. Then they've got to learn about the business, and they'll usually know something about programming. So you're talking about a bit of a 2 or 3 year investment in getting someone who can just sort of cope with the basic skills.
If you come from the analyst skill, or if you come from the advanced analytics skill set, maybe a little bit closer, but still they're probably more used, because the data's come to them structured for a very long time.
That's right.
It's still, even within that group of people, there's still limitations. Some of them will be able to handle the fact that suddenly, actually, most of their job is about actually bringing the data together, getting the structure right, making sure the right information is in there when it starts going through the tools and when you start using the algorithms. And those are the guys that are the real cream. But you've got to actually start working with the broader skill set of those who are used to structured data and bringing them on the journey of actually, you've got the skills to do this, you've been doing it for years, it's just a different application. The same approach.
We mentioned the fact that telcos and the financial sector do possess rich data sets. But look, what about the government and the public sector? Does big data and analytics, does it have a role to play in the future of government?
I believe so. I think it has a huge role to play within government. I think there are challenges within government which hopefully can be overcome to really deliver on some of this value, such as what's the legislation around how can we take data assets from different departments, fuse them together to generate new data products, and who do those data products go to? I mean, potentially there's huge benefit both internally to actually deliver those data products to the government and externally to Australian society, and I think we haven't even touched the surface on
well, ATO and Centrelink, they've probably got as much data as your average bank,
And you're seeing, overseas again, we're seeing the use of that data in a range of areas that you're starting to see. These tools are used in areas like fraud and abuse. So again, the kind of Centrelink ATO type models, equations, and big data is only going to enhance that. At the moment, that's the wealth of structured data they've got, which is in many cases untapped, and now the ability to add another layer. So I think you actually look at most departments, even you go through some of the areas like defence, etc. They have a wealth of information that they probably haven't been able to do much with today. These capabilities will enable them to actually sift through that information and look at how they operate better.
And a lot of those challenges aren't anything to do with the availability of information or the technology. A lot of them are, internal barriers about who can share what information under what circumstances, and so those protocols become the barrier rather than having access to the data.
It's like there were two barriers before. One was technology and one was the imagination. The technology one's been removed. Now it's just the imagination in the way.
But surely there's
I think there are other barriers. It's not just the imagination.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
I think people would be concerned if we started just.
I was just going to say
that pulling data from different departments and packaging up data products.
Because I think that has to be an implication that should not be overlooked. This idea of Big Brother, this idea of people's privacy, and I think whenever we're talking about data, and I guess this is not just something about the government. I'm thinking if it's a bank or a telco, there has to be an understandable amount of reticence and concern about this idea of privacy. So when in your practice, what are you guys seeing? What do you hear from your clients? And
well, privacy overrides everything.
Yes.
So it's not an option or another requirement. It overrides everything. So everything that's done with data, big data or any other type of data, privacy and security blanket over a lot of it. So you just don't risk it and factor it into everything. So.
Absolutely.
I think one of the things that we're seeing is that because of the emphasis on things like personalisation in the early 2000s, organisations did kind of learn a lesson there and realised that too much personal information can actually turn people away from you as a retailer, for example, or as a bank, or even as a government that makes people fairly suspicious. So there is this kind of fine line, there's this balance, and so you've certainly got security and privacy, but there's this kind of emerging area of respect for the consumer or the constituent in government. And that's how the data is more likely to be applied now. They're the good use cases, is where, are we respecting the interaction that we're having with that individual or business to business if it's an organisation. And that's something that I think most technologists, have an inherent sense of respect for others, but from an organisational perspective, that may not be embodied in the way that the company does business every day. It may not be congruent with people's values. So I think that's also one of the things that I'm seeing change is, yes, you can come up with all the great use cases in the world about how we can target consumers more effectively or how we can prevent fraud by doing more detailed analysis and trying to predict crimes rather than letting them happen first and punish them afterwards. But there is that very fine line, and trying to get that line right is challenging sometimes.
And I think it's a line that's ever moving. When we talked earlier about this premise, there is more of an expectation from consumers now, and I do honestly believe that's true. Doesn't mean you don't have to work within the privacy and security frameworks that are present at the day, and you have to do that. And again, part of that experience and that relationship is going to be about that respect piece. Again, you've got to build a relationship with your consumers. That's got to be based around what you understand about them. But yes, if you push that too far, you're going to lose that relationship because you don't respect the outcome that you're saying. So I do see privacy, I think, is going to change over time, because I think the expectation of consumers is changing. But that has got to be a very careful, very slow process. It probably starts with respect, and respect will lead, and then legislation will eventually
that's right.
follow.
It is a very fine line, but it's a movable line.
Yes.
And ironically, big data can help, because you can do some of that analysis to work out, are we pushing the line too hard, too far? What do we need to pull back on? How do we do that? So
you can see an environment where you could actually use the wealth of data available to really understand not only who you should be targeting, but actually understanding how you should be targeting, how often, and understand what that person's view of that relationship is and that respect is.
Yes.
Potentially there.
Now, we started off, with regards to the cloud. And I mean, we've sort of, I know it's not always easy to make that connection. It might not be the valid connection sometimes, cloud and big data. But surely the maturity in the cloud computing market, given that maturity, at some point, big data and cloud are going to come together. And perhaps through, whether they're applications or storing the data in the cloud. How do you see that playing out? Are big data and cloud going to work hand in hand at some point?
Well, as an independent industry analyst firm, we actually said early on that we didn't think these two would ever come together because of the issues of the volume of data and just transferring that data and latency and all of the issues involved from a technical perspective. And yet we are seeing some really interesting applications like retailers who are sharing data in a cloud environment which overcomes all of the transportation of data and all of the duplicate processes that have to go on to cleanse that data through all of the supply chain participants. And it removed a lot of political boundaries as well. So you could have a service provider providing the business analytics as a service, and it removed a lot of that duplication, a lot of the cost, a lot of the complexity, increased the quality of the data that was being produced as an output, and kept everyone in the supply chain a little bit happier. It's a unique situation, but we didn't kind of expect to see these two things overlap. We've also seen organisations using big data applications. So these are not traditional data warehouse style implementations. These are, I need a big data application for a limited period of time. And so they'll use something like AWS to create a big data environment in the cloud, run the application, and then destroy it afterwards. They no longer need it. It's not a permanent piece of technology. It's not required on a long-term basis. So that temporal use of big data applications is something that we're also seeing.
I think the major challenges, cloud's a wonderful platform potentially for big data analytics. I think the challenges are around, number one, data assets. Does it violate the privacy concerns and the corporate privacy policy and security policy to actually move the data into the cloud? If it doesn't, then that's great. And I think moving on to more sort of shared data asset resources where a cloud provider could potentially provide data products through those shared resources. I think it comes down to strategic value to an organisation. So if an organisation generates data or even generates part of the data, what strategic benefit or threat is it to actually then provide that data, which is then going to be packaged up as data products for other organisations? So it really comes down to whether those two things can be overcome.
Yeah, I'd sort of say it's an it depends sort of answer. I think cloud and big data are different things, and certainly if you interpret big data as an analytics kind of thing, which is essentially the way we've been talking about it, and it has other interpretations like Google and Yahoo, and they're obviously cloud players and using big data, but in that analytics interpretation, yes, you might make use of some cloud technology to help if it makes sense, and it's really that's the thing, if it makes sense. Originally I would have said no, because a lot of that analytics, the capability comes from the massive parallelism, and almost by definition the cloud is kind of very homogeneous. So can you do the highly differentiated, highly parallel processing on a cloud layer? Probably not. But it's not only about big volumes of data, we've sort of agreed it's also about the complexity of the algorithms and the types of things you're doing, and that could be done on a cloud quite easily. Yeah.
Can also be about, given the relevant business model, about the accessibility and the capability to, again, that real-time, on-the-fly environment where the ability to go up and down, get that data quickly and readily, do those analytics on the fly to actually deliver something. Now, quite possibly that's the creation of the options, the variances that you might do, then that could still be done in a more traditional environment. But then the actual application of it, I can see very readily using a cloud-based approach to enable the flexibility of access. And if you've got a business model where you've got a very disparate workforce and work engagement with your consumers or your sites of operation, then that could be a benefit there.
Yeah. We've actually seen some confusion around this idea of cloud too with big data. We've seen early on many clients go and just buy a big Oracle Exadata box to increase their storage and processing capacity, or implement SAP's HANA product because in-memory analytics are good and that's going to solve all of their challenges. And they do that on the basis that it's private cloud. And I think that this is one of the challenges too, is to work out exactly what that big data architecture, as you were saying before, how that fits into the various incarnations of cloud architectures that are out there, and how do you bring these things together and make them work seamlessly and still have the expectation. I know of a lot of customers who have spent a lot of money in just increasing their capacity, but they've still got the same problems that they started out with.
Again, that comes back to the earlier conversation.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
they've just bought themselves some time, but that's
Exactly.
And it's not necessarily about the volume of data that you store.
That's right.
No,
It's about how you analyse and drive insight from it.
That's right.
And it's potentially it's about making sure you can always recreate at least a sample of that full view of everything you've got. But
Exactly.
The reality is you've got to get to the stage, I think the time will come when the wealth of data is going to mean that regardless of the volume and cost of storage, you're still going to want to bring data in, get the insights, get the understanding, work out what you want to keep, and just keep that.
And we tend to do the easy things
I would
first.
disagree with that.
Yeah, fair enough.
I see the big data paradigm to be more the Google approach, and that is store everything or ingest everything so that you give the maximum opportunity to your analysts to answer the questions. As soon as you start throwing things away, then I guess you've just limited their opportunity.
Yeah, I understand that. And that's the kind of conundrum
how
I
do you
see
know
in that
what's
space.
useful and what's
Or
not?
keeping it, but in what form?
Yeah.
You don't
Sure.
necessarily have to have every atomic element of data to be able to gain insights from it. You might want it, but you know.
To me, that's a cost thing, and if the cost is low, you would tend to keep it.
That's right.
You know, why would you even bother setting up something to get rid of it? In a way,
That's right.
it costs you money to get rid of it as
That's
well as to
right.
keep it. So I think people are going to keep it raw, keep data raw, especially the semi-structured and unstructured stuff. The structured stuff will just all go straight into databases.
Yes.
But if the databases don't cost much to hold data in, and how many of us are good at archiving data out of data warehouses anyhow? Not many of us do it very often.
True.
So Mark, how does Telstra deal with its data sets, given that you would have an enormous amount of data?
Mainly relational databases from a technical point of view, and lots of systems. And the same data, it does actually get replicated. There's lots of different usages for the same data. So, you're going to be sending your call records into your fraud systems, into your billing systems, into your network management systems. So that data gets all over the place. Telstra also buys packages. So, each package a lot of the packages want to see customer, a lot of the packages want to see location, a lot of the packages want to see product. So we know product data spread around the place as well. So the reality is, we end up with lots of systems with lots and lots and lots of data in them, and that data is managed across those systems, which is quite a big challenge, data management challenge in itself, and we've always had that problem. But technology-wise, I think we'd have a preference for relational databases. We would look at the fringe stuff for specific uses like Hadoop or non-relational NoSQL style databases, perhaps. But it'd be on a case-by-case basis, and our preference would be to stick to the technology we know, because what we know will happen is the relational database vendors will buy up the small players, incorporate those products in. Hadoop's a bit of an exception because they got first to market and they're free, so it's pretty hard for IBM or Oracle to compete with that. But they'll just connect to it, right, and they'll hide it in the background, and that's kind of what we want to have.
Or they just add layers on top of it and
Yeah, that's right.
call it their own flavour of it.
Yeah, that's right.
No, just getting back to what we were talking about, whether it's a good idea to actually hold on to all the data or be careful and start excising stuff that might not be important. I mean, what are the sort of costs are we talking about? How much does it cost to keep data at the moment? Is it an expensive procedure or?
Cost of storage depends on the platform. Cost of storage, if you put it on a low-cost platform, it's not expensive. But if you keep it on a high-cost Teradata style platform, it's expensive. So
I mean, is it justified for an organization to say, look, it's actually better for us to actually hold on to everything?
There are legal reasons to get rid of it at some point. So at some point, when it gets to its end of its life from a records management perspective, you can argue then about whether we do get rid of it or don't get rid of it. But when you're doing model building in particular,
Yes.
as opposed to reporting, like the person who's used to reporting will say, what would I ever want to look at 5-year-old data for? But if you're a model builder and you're trying to predict trends, you need 5 years of data.
Yeah.
So
No, you want more than that. I mean, it's just whether you take it on the whole breadth or everything else. I think it's something that's going to evolve over time. I think the reality is we're moving to such scales of data that we're going to look at different ways of managing that. And I think if you start using different forms of storing, that then potentially provides the resolution.
Well, I think that this is going to be a problem going forward because as some of the Hadoop style implementations prove themselves and you start to see the value out of those implementations, people will start questioning the investment that they made in the traditional technologies, and they'll say, hang on a minute, we can do this really impressive stuff over here in this really cheap system compared to some really simple stuff in these big expensive systems. When are we going to stop doing that? And
I think the big expensive systems are becoming cheaper, and total cost of ownership of Hadoop, when you take into account data scientists, is quite high.
Absolutely. But not taking into account, I guess, the human resources around analytics. I think if we look at storing data on Hadoop versus on an RDBMS, we're probably looking at an order of magnitude different cost.
Yeah, that's right.
At least.
And I think it's interesting because, like, talking about architecture, where does Hadoop sit in terms of the role it might play in a reporting analytics architecture, and where would cloud sit? Now, we're looking at an idea of a data hub, so building a data hub, which is about data provisioning, so collecting data together, no structuring, not trying to conform it to a common information model and then provisioning from there to reuse extracts and things. Data hub, you'd say, okay, that just should be a file kind of process, right? Should we stick Hadoop there?
Sounds like a good solution.
Well, it could be, but then it could be cloud, because we're not going to do massive parallel processing from there. So it could be Hadoop, or it could be just cloud storage. Where would Hadoop play? Well, Hadoop would certainly play in the analytics end. So you're probably going to end up with Hadoop in your architecture, but I think it'll be more around analytics, because you want that massive parallel processing across lots of files, and that's what Hadoop's good at. Sure, you can just stick data in there, but it might be cheaper just to stick the data in a cloud virtual storage.
I think that we're going to see much more of that, where the guys who do this really well think about it as an architecture.
Yep.
But the challenge is it's easy to get a product through procurement.
Yeah.
So, a vendor comes to you with a product that you can just buy and put through your procurement process. Yeah, I'll take one of those, thank you very much. Yeah. It may not give you the same benefit. It may actually lock you into something that you don't want to be locked into cost-wise or flexibility. You might not have access to some of the external services that provide the deep analytics capabilities, right?
Yeah.
That fit on top of Hadoop or work conjointly with it. So now you've got this paradox of, I can do this really well by architecting it properly, or I could get slammed by a vendor who comes in with a productized solution that sells me something, whether it's real or not in some
And see, this is a
Yeah.
difficult question too, because on the other hand, you've got the pressure that, hey, we're missing out. If you're trying to play catch
Absolutely.
up, then the procurement idea seems very logical and
Sure.
very alluring, right? Rather than taking that time. But then, as you're saying, you might end up paying a price for it later on down the line.
Well, as a data scientist, what would your preference be?
Whether you go for single appliance or architectural design?
Yeah.
Look, for us, from our perspective, it doesn't really make much of a difference. I mean, all we care about is having a platform where all of the data is there and we can run our analytics on top. If it's a single SKU from a vendor, or if it's an architectural design with 1,000 SKUs that you had to build internally, it really doesn't make a big difference to us.
Throw it over the wall.
And it's IT's problem.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Don't worry, we'll help.
Look, I mean, at the core of this, though, it's really it comes down to decision making, right? And I mean, what I find it's complex about this is who makes this decision. At a corporate level, a lot of the stuff that we've just covered would be quite challenging and be quite intimidating, So
Yeah.
how do we sort of make that connection? I mean, of sort of simplifying this, or who really has to take the lead here? Is it the IT teams who have to come across and say, guys, this is what we can do, or?
When you've got a kind of an IT-led thing, and it's arguable where the big data is, but let's say it's an IT-led thing, the IT people have been dipping their fingers in it for longer. I think it's up to them to then educate the business and suggest opportunities and help them understand, what they might get out of it, but they have to make the decisions in the end, because they've got to own the solution. And they own the problem already. So, to me, Telstra is very big. So some business people will come in with, hey, I understand this big data stuff. I can solve this problem. What do you think? And that's good. But where IT's kind of pushing it or is ahead, they should act as thought leaders. Ultimately, though, big data is no different to anything else. Ultimately, someone in the business has got to pick it up, own it, operate it after it's built and deployed, and really extract the value. IT's not going to extract the value out of it. So I think our job really is to educate, suggest opportunities, help people understand what it's about, that kind of stuff. And it's hard because big data, when you look at it, what a kind of crazy phenomenon. I haven't seen a phenomenon explode in IT like this for a long time. It's really got a lot of hype, and it's quite hard to pick out the bits that are actually real and the bits that are just noise. They might be interesting facts, like, data's growing at some phenomenal rate, you can go up to the moon and back 5 times with CDs or whatever. Yeah. Okay, that's good to know, but what can I actually use in my business? What's real and what's not real? That's the...
And that comes back to that experimentation we were talking about earlier, and using that's got to build the case for change.
Yeah.
And that has to engage with the business. Again, it's got to be about solving business problems or driving business opportunities.
Yeah.
And through that experimentation, through understanding the potential value, you build the case for change. You can engage with the executive across the whole organisation, which is what you need buy-in from to really actually take these kind of opportunities to the absolute maximum.
Yeah. Well, and our research says that organisations only use about 1 to 5% of the data that they have now.
Yep.
So that's not even getting value out of it, that's just using it.
Yep.
So you know, there's a big gap between
There is
you
a
know
big
transformational big data implementations and just this incremental improvement to business intelligence and analytics through you know the traditional data warehousing approach.
Yep.
There's a big leap that needs to occur somewhere. How's that going to happen? And I think it is, you know, as you said, it's leadership and it's you know creating the vision, having the strong business commitment to it, but you've got to have some proof points along the way. And you know, I see organisations, I've long said as an analyst, the worst thing in the world is to have a proof of concept, because you can't prove a concept. It's just a concept is. But if you approach it as a proof of process, you can work out, you know, what needs to change to make this work, as opposed to a proof of concept, which is, did it work or not? Yes, no. It's a very binary outcome. But that kind of cultural change for organisations is very difficult. You know, they're not used to failing. They're not used to having, let's just try something and see how it goes, and if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. We're all chasing the idea of perfection still.
Yeah, test and learn is still very sort of premature within enterprise. I mean, enterprise doesn't like to test and learn.
Yes,
they
exactly.
like to outsource anything that's risky. And
Well, that's the good thing about Agile. Agile has sort of slowly, drip by drip, changing the mindset in large companies away from, you know, the old systems development life cycles, everything in sequence, and breaking things down into small pieces. So I think organisations are more willing to experiment now. Used to be just all put in the R&D bucket right now, but people are playing around with things a lot more and a lot more experimental. Certainly in Telstra, we're going down that direction in a big way. So that's good. But the other thing is, you might notice that a lot of the examples is still the internal data. It's the data we've already got. It's not bringing in new data. And you know, we've got 7 big data warehouses, and they're still pretty much islands. And we've got about 160 something, pretty solid reporting systems, and they're all still pretty much islands. So it's just getting all that data we've always had together and getting stuff out of it. And there's a thing, value density kind of concept here too, which is data we own has got a lot of value in it. It's dense in value. Like if I've got a customer record, a Telstra customer record, every single field means something to me, right? But if I'm trawling through Facebook, the value density is very, very low. Like how many comments in there are about Telstra, are very low density, very hard to find that information. So I think a lot of people are going to focus their big data on just going over their own data again, where there's high value density. So,
I mean, is that a conversation you have a lot with organisations? I mean, you look at data, and your approach to data obviously would be quite different to when you're speaking to an organisation of how they view data.
That's right. I mean, we come in under the big data premise, of course, and as Mark rightly pointed out, the first thing that we sort of discussed with customers, we've got to get them past the idea that we're not going to mine Facebook, we're not going to mine Twitter, and we're not going to be going through blogs. Actually, you're sitting on a gold mine. Your gold mine is your own enterprise data assets, and you're probably touching 1 to 2% of those data assets. And if we touch another 2 or 3%, there's potential for adding huge value to business. And it really comes from being able to bring those data assets together in one place so that we can now start looking across the data assets instead of the more siloed approach that most organisations have gone into, because they've had siloed parts of the organisation, such as finance, sales, risk, marketing, and so forth.
And certainly from our perspective, being an observer on the industry, what we're seeing now is that organisations are doing exactly that. They're just looking at their internal data, and the very small percentage of organisations who are really pushing the boundaries, they're the ones who are looking at external data. But it's that difference between the incremental benefit that you can get from just doing something that you've always done a little bit better versus let's do something radically different and change the game. And I think if you look at the CEO, he's probably more interested in what's happening outside his organisation than what's happening inside his or her organisation, right? So there's that inherent disconnect straight away. We get more value from peripheral vision than we do from that direct line of sight. And that's something that we're not good at doing with the traditional approach to data warehousing. So I agree, and we're certainly seeing that focus start internally, but the greatest value is going to be added when you do start to integrate some of these external.
And I think where we're seeing, we've got tools in the space that will look at social media, look at trends, and identify the information there. It's very much being used for that, understanding what's happening at the moment, rather than actually pointed use of that data to better understand individual customers or whatever it might be. You see some conversations in areas where they don't necessarily have the direct relationship with their customers, so that the FMCG manufacturers, for example, where they're getting very much squeezed by the retailers, the ability to actually potentially start building a relationship via social media, via these other channels, there's some conversations to be had there. But I think, yeah, it's a stepping stone. People are starting to use external data, but they're using it very much as just a view of what's happening out there and identifying issues.
Yeah, but most of those are pretty silly use cases, to be honest. I mean, you know, the emphasis on social media analysis. Okay, I'm going to find out whether somebody's talking about me positively or negatively. Am I going to change, you know, PR strategy based on what somebody's saying about me? All that's well and good. I don't necessarily need to do that in-house. I can have an agency do that on my behalf and feed me the data. Is it actually going to change the way I do business on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, no, I agree entirely.
And I think that's where we're at, is kind of identifying, well, I feel like there's something in it. The social media stuff, it might be a benefit, but I think there's something more to it than this, and I don't know what that is.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a privacy minefield as well. You know, if I'm a Telstra customer and I suddenly realise that Telstra's trawling Facebook and all that, and so I'm pulling information and identifying it with me, and then based on that information they trawled from the internet, they're doing stuff, I don't know if I'd be very happy. So I'd certainly want an opt-in kind of thing around that, and I'd certainly be thinking through the privacy and security and legal side of that all very, very carefully. You know.
Of course, businesses do this.
Yeah, well, there's a good example of an airline in Europe who it was much more of a PR exercise than the social media strategy, but they got quite a bit of press over it, and it was by looking at people's Facebook pages, analysing their interests, and then when they checked into the airport, they would give them a magazine on their favourite topic or whatever the situation was. And it was more of a PR strategy than the social media strategy. But it's, you know, interesting that the reaction that you would get from customers if that was a real environment would be very mixed. Some people would love it, and some people would really dislike it.
That's right.
So, you know, that's that respect line, and trying to work out where that line is you know, not a business or a technology issue independently. It's very much a combined issue.
But I guess the pervasiveness of social media kind of makes it a very accessible point for businesses, doesn't it?
Yeah, across the board, in that, you know, small, medium, large businesses have the ability or potential ability to get social media, but we shouldn't forget just how hard it is to actually get data from Facebook. I mean, you know, Facebook doesn't open up their Graph API for any business to go and trawl the whole of Facebook. You really do basically need to opt in. So people, you know, need to, even if you like a page, that's not opting in. You know, you've got to basically give people, you know, access through an application being installed on their Facebook page or something like that. So I mean, I think we should not underestimate the, you know, the challenges in actually getting access to social media data. And then even when we overcome those challenges, the challenges in actually deriving quality insights that can be actioned out of that data, I think that's non-trivial.
Yeah.
Because deriving quality is a whole different kettle of fish, isn't it? Getting the data is one thing, and having it at one, storing it is one thing, but getting that quality again is a whole different...
Getting quality insights that can actually be actioned by the business. So, you know, if Qantas hears that everybody's bagging out Qantas today, what does Qantas do? Do Qantas take planes off the runway and say, okay, we should now start running buses between Canberra and Sydney because people are upset about the carbon tax? Or, I mean, what's actionable out of social media? I mean, maybe there are insights that can be derived, but what's actionable?
Now, guys, you know, just like BYOD and the cloud, I think we have an understanding now that with BYOD, organizations, I mean, every one of these trends has challenged the traditional way of, you know, decision making, of accepting something within the workplace. And we are seeing acceptance now, say when it comes to BYOD. They know it can't be stopped. We have to now learn to accept it. We're starting to see a bit of maturity in the cloud market, starting to understand that, hey, here's something that we can derive quick value out of, you know, if we focus on it right now. How do you see the big data story playing out? Because obviously deriving quality results out of big data is going to require a much more nuanced, a much more thorough sort of a focus. So how do you see the big data story playing out?
From the analyst point of view, we see a lot of interest and a lot of activity. There's still a lot of skepticism out there, and that's going to take some time to dispel as well. But I'd certainly see that in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see some pretty spectacular failures of large-scale projects that go horribly, horribly wrong. But we'll also see...
Is that good in some ways?
Well, it's not good for those companies that fail, but we'll also see some very spectacular successes as well. And it's identifying, you know, what are the differences between those failed projects and the successful ones that organisations should pay a lot of attention to. And they're not always the immediately obvious things. It's, you know, it's not about the structure of your project team necessarily, or the quality of the consultant that you get in to run this for you. There are some really simple things that you can do and have massive impact. So I think that the opportunities out there are immense, but to identify what are the opportunities that are worth pursuing, you know, they have the biggest reward for the smallest amount of risk. That's always been a challenge for everyone.
That's non-trivial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's all the time we have, gentlemen. I thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us at this panel. And I'm certain that our viewers have gained quite a lot of useful insight. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.